Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Stories. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Lurking Shadow. The town of Glenhaven had always been a peaceful place, nestled in the valley between two towering mountains. Its population was small, the people friendly, and the air crisp and clean. But there was a dark undercurrent to the town, something not often spoken about, whispers of a shadow that lingered just beyond the edge of the woods. It was in fall of 1992 when Mark, a young journalist eager to make a name for himself, moved to Glenhaven. He had heard the rumors about the town's dark history and was determined to investigate them. He rented a small cottage on the outskirts of the town, near the woods where the shadow was set to appear. The locals were friendly enough, but they avoided the subject when he asked about the woods, their eyes flickering nervously. One evening, as Mark sat in his cottage, typing up notes from his day's interviews, he heard a tapping at the window. Surprised, he got up and looked out. It was dark, the sky an inky black, with only the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the trees. No one was there. Shaking his head, he returned to his desk, dismissing it as the wind or his imagination. But a few minutes later, it happened again, a gentle tapping at the window, as if someone was trying to get his attention. Mark's curiosity got the best of him. He walked over to the window and peered into the night. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, just out of the reach of the moonlight. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible against the dark trees. Mark squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure remained still and silent. Then, without warning, it moved. It was swift and unnatural, gliding forward with an eerie smoothness that sent a chill down Mark's spine. He staggered back from the window, his breath catching in his throat. The figure had vanished, swallowed by the darkness. The following days were filled with the strange feeling that Mark was being watched. He would walk through the small town, and every now and then, he would catch glimpses of something moving just out of the corner of his eye. It was always the same, a tall, dark figure standing just at the edge of his vision, never quite close enough to be seen clearly. Determined to uncover the truth, Mark decided to venture into the woods where the figure had first appeared. Armed with a flashlight and his journal, he made his way through the dense trees one evening, the air growing colder with each step. The woods were eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. As Mark ventured deeper, he began to feel the weight of something pressing down on him, like an invisible force was pushing against him. The flashlight flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the trees. He paused, his heart racing, but all he could hear was the faint rustling of the leaves. Then, as he turned a corner, he saw it. The figure stood in the clearing ahead of him, its tall, thin form silhouetted by the faint light of the moon. It was motionless, like a statue, staring into the distance. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Something about the figure was wrong and natural. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin. It appeared almost as though it were a shadow itself, a darkness that took shape. Before Mark could react, the figure slowly turned toward him. Its face was featureless, just a blank expanse of shadow where eyes and a mouth should be. The air around Mark grew colder, and a deep, guttural voice echoed in his mind. "You shouldn't have come." Mark's legs froze, his body refusing to move as the figure took a slow step toward him. The ground beneath Mark's feet seemed to shift, the trees bending and warping, as if the very world around him was coming apart. With a surge of adrenaline, Mark broke free from the paralysis and ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he sprinted through the trees. The shadows of the woods seemed to close in on him, twisting and reaching, as if the very forest itself was alive and hunting him. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of his cottage, his heart pounding in his chest. The door slammed shut behind him, and for a moment he simply stood there, gasping for air. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained, a cold presence that lingered in the back of his mind for the next few days. Mark tried to put the experience out of his mind, but it was impossible. The shadow seemed to follow him wherever he went. Every time he looked out the window, there it was, standing just beyond the trees, its form barely visible against the darkness. He could feel its eyes on him, even when he wasn't looking, and the whispers began again, growing louder and more insistent. "You shouldn't have come." The voice echoed in his mind, filling his every thought. It was as if the shadow was inside him, a part of his very soul. He couldn't escape it. Desperate for answers, Mark sought out the town's oldest resident, Mrs. Abernathy, who was said to know the town's history better than anyone. She lived in a small cottage near the edge of town, surrounded by a garden of withered flowers. When Mark arrived at her door, she greeted him with a knowing look, as if she had been expecting him. She invited him in and offered him tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the liquid. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Mark nodded, his throat dry. "What is it? What is that thing in the woods?" Mrs. Abernathy sighed, setting the teapot down. "It's an ancient presence, a shadow that has lingered in these woods for centuries. It's not of this world, it's a spirit, a being that feeds on fear and curiosity. It was summoned long ago, during the founding of this town, by a group of misguided people who thought they could control it. They were wrong." She paused, her eyes darkening. "The shadow is bound to these woods, but it can reach out to those who stray too close. It waits for the curious, the brave, the foolish, anyone who dares to uncover the truth. Once it finds someone, it doesn't let them go. It feeds on their fear, growing stronger with each passing day." Mark's stomach twisted with dread. "How do I stop it?" Mrs. Abernathy looked at him gravely. "You can't. Once it has chosen you, there's no escape. You can try to run, but it will always be with you, lurking in the darkness. And one day, when it's ready, it will take you." Mark left Mrs. Abernathy's cottage with a heavy heart, her words echoing in his mind. That night, he tried to sleep, but the whispers were louder than ever. The shadows in his room grew longer, reaching across the walls, twisting and curling like dark tendrils. The next morning, Mark was gone. His cottage was empty, his belongings left behind in a hasty mess. The townspeople searched for him, but there was no sign of where he had gone. Some say the shadow claimed him. Others believe he simply left, unable to bear the weight of the town's dark history. But those who knew the truth could only shake their heads and whisper one thing: once the shadow claims you, it never lets you go. And the figure, tall and thin, continues to watch from the woods, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to wander too close. Story 2. The Sleepless Neighbor. Lena had always prided herself on being a light sleeper. She could hear the slightest rustle of leaves outside her window, the hum of a passing car, or the soft creak of the floorboards. When someone walked through the hallway of her apartment building. But lately, something had been keeping her awake more than usual, something that made her toss and turn every night, her mind racing with fear. It started about a month ago. Lena had recently moved to a new apartment, a charming little place on the top floor of an old building. The neighbors were quiet, mostly elderly people who kept to themselves, so Lena thought it was the perfect place to settle down. But soon, she began to hear something strange at night. At first, it was just a faint sound of tapping, like someone gently knocking on a door. But it came at odd hours, always in the dead of night when everything else was still. The sound would echo through the walls, reverberating in her ears until she couldn't ignore it anymore. Lena tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just the building settling, she thought. But the tapping grew louder, more persistent, until it sounded like someone was actually knocking on her door. It wasn't a random occurrence either. It happened every night, around the same time, right at midnight. One night, unable to take it any longer, Lena decided to confront whoever it was. She threw on her robe, grabbed a flashlight, and made her way down the narrow hallway to the source of the noise. The building was old, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet as she walked. The tapping seemed to be coming from the apartment across the hall, door that had always been shut tight. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The sound was coming from inside, faint but unmistakable. She knocked gently, then a little louder. There was no answer. Curious and a little unnerved, Lena pressed her ear to the door. She could hear something else now, a low, rhythmic sound, like someone breathing heavily. It was deep and labored, almost like a sigh of exhaustion. She knocked again, this time with more urgency. "Hello, is everything okay?" she called, her voice shaking slightly. Still, there was no response. Lena's heart raced. Something didn't feel right. She wasn't sure what was going on behind that door, but she had a sinking feeling that she didn't want to know. Suddenly, the door creaked open, just a few inches. Lena stepped back in surprise, her pulse quickening. A man appeared in the doorway, tall, thin figure with hollow eyes and dark circles under his skin. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice raspy and distant. Lena swallowed hard. I've been hearing strange noises, breathing coming from your apartment. Is everything all right?" The man blinked slowly, as if processing her words. Then, without another word, he stepped aside and motioned for her to come in. "I don't mind," he said, his voice flat, "but you won't be able to sleep either." Lena hesitated for a long moment, but her curiosity got the better of her. She stepped into the apartment, the door closing softly behind her. Inside, the apartment was dark and cluttered. Papers and clothes were strewn across the floor, and the air felt thick with dust. The man led her to the living room, where a dim light flickered from a single lamp. And there, sitting in the corner, was a chair, a large, old armchair, facing a blank wall. Lena frowned. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer right away. He stood behind the chair, looking down at it with a strange intensity. Then, his voice broke the silence. "I haven't slept in years," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Every night I sit in that chair, and I wait." Lena's stomach tightened. Wait for what? The man's eyes seemed to glaze over. "For the dreams. They come to me every night But they're not like normal dreams. They're alive. They can't be stopped. And the longer I stay awake, the worse they get. Lena stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. The tapping, the breathing, it's you, isn't it? You're doing this? The man nodded slowly. I can't help it. The dreams, they don't let me sleep. They demand attention. They want to be known. Lena's mind raced. What kind of dreams? The man's face twisted in anguish. They're not dreams at all. They're memories. Horrible memories of things I've done, things I've seen, things that aren't even real, but they feel so real. And the more I try to block them out, the more they come. They whisper to me, they tap on the walls, they breathe down my neck. Lena felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he spoke, like he was no longer entirely in control of his own mind. Please, she said, her voice trembling, you need help. You can't keep living like this. The man just stared at her, his eyes hollow. I've tried everything. I've tried sleeping pills, therapy, even locking myself away, but it doesn't work. The more I fight, the stronger they become, and the longer I stay awake, the more they take from me. Lena felt a chill in the air. Suddenly, the tapping began again. Louder now, echoing through the apartment. It wasn't just coming from the walls, it was coming from everywhere. Lena could hear it in her ears, feel it in her bones. Please, you need to get out of here, the man whispered urgently. If you don't leave now, they'll find you too. They'll never let you sleep. They'll make you one of them. Lena's heart raced. She turned to leave. But as she reached the door, she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. The tapping stopped, and then, in the silence, a voice whispered from the shadows, "We're waiting for you." Lena spun around, but the man was gone. The apartment was empty, the chair facing the blank wall once again, but the whispers remained, echoing through the room, filling her head with a growing sense of dread. She ran from the apartment, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't escape the feeling that whatever had taken hold of the man had now turned its attention to her. From that night on, Lena couldn't sleep. No matter how hard she tried, the tapping, the breathing, and the whispers followed her everywhere. They would come in the dead of night, just as they had with the man, always at midnight. And slowly, over time, she found herself slipping into the same madness, unable to tell what was real and what was just a nightmare. And in the end, just like the man before her, Lena sat in her dark apartment, staring at the wall, waiting for the dreams to come. As she made her way deeper into the house, she noticed strange things. Portraits on the walls, their faces eerily blank, as if they had been erased. The furniture, covered in white sheets, seemed to have been untouched for years. But the oddest thing was the sound whispers, faint and distant, like voices coming from the walls themselves. They were too soft to make out, but Sarah could feel them, like a presence in the air. She reached the staircase, the old wood creaking beneath her feet. The whispers grew louder as she ascended, pulling her toward the second floor. At the top of the stairs, the long hallway stretched out before her, lined with closed doors. One door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar, a dim light spilling out from the crack. Sarah's legs felt heavy, but she couldn't stop herself. She walked toward the door, drawn to it as if by some invisible force. When she pushed it open, her breath caught in her throat. The room was unlike any she had ever seen. The walls were lined with mirrors, floor to ceiling, reflecting the room over and over again. There was a large, ornate chair in the center of the room, facing away from her, and in the chair, sitting perfectly still, was a figure. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her hair dark and long, cascading over her shoulders. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was the way the woman sat motionless, as if she were waiting. "Come closer," the voice whispered, the same voice she had heard before. Sarah couldn't resist. She stepped forward, her body moving on its own, until she was standing just behind the chair. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the back of the woman's chair. The woman's head snapped around, her eyes wide and unblinking, her face a mask of sheer terror. But before Sarah could react, the mirrors around her began to distort. The room seemed to grow larger, the reflections becoming more warped and twisted. The woman's lips parted in a silent scream, and suddenly Sarah felt herself being pulled backward, as if the mirrors themselves were drawing her in. She tried to scream, to run, but her body wasn't hers to control. The room seemed to close in on her, the mirrors reflecting 1,000 versions of herself, each more distorted than the last. As the mirrors warped and cracked, Sarah's vision blurred. She felt herself falling, as if the very fabric of reality had come undone. The last thing she saw before everything went black was her own face, staring back at her from the shattered mirror. When Sarah woke, she was no longer in the room with the mirrors. She was standing at the front door of the house, her hands cold and trembling. The door was wide open, as if she had just walked out. But something was different. Everything was silent. The whispers were gone. The house was still. She turned to look at the house one last time, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching her. But this time, the face wasn't unfamiliar. It was her own. As she walked away, the house seemed to fade into the shadows, as if it were never really there. And though Sarah tried to forget the horrors she had experienced, she could never shake the feeling that the house on Ash Lane was still there, waiting for her or for someone else. Story 4. The Reflection. Megan had always been the type to appreciate the quiet moments in life. She enjoyed the stillness of her small apartment, the way the light filtered through the curtains in the morning, and the peace that came with her solitary routines. So when she decided to invest in an antique mirror she found at a local thrift store, she thought it would add to the charm of her living space. The mirror was large, with an ornate silver frame that had a weathered elegance to it. It seemed like the perfect addition to her apartment. At first, everything was fine. Megan hung the mirror on the wall in her hallway, right across from her bedroom door, where it would catch the light in mornings. But soon, she began to feel something strange. It wasn't the mirror itself, but the way it seemed to distort things. Whenever Megan walked past it, she would catch a glimpse of something off in the reflection, something that wasn't there in the room. It was subtle at first, a shadow darting across the hallway or a movement in the corner of the frame, but it quickly escalated. The more she looked at it, the more she saw things that weren't present in her real self. She would glance at the mirror while walking by and swear she saw a figure standing in the hallway behind her doll, dark and blurry, like a shadow that didn't quite belong. At first, she convinced herself it was just the play of light and the odd angle of the reflection. But the figure didn't go away. It lingered, like it was waiting. One evening, after a long day of work, Megan returned home, feeling exhausted. She kicked off her shoes and walked into the kitchen to prepare dinner. As she passed by the hallway mirror, she caught sight of something new. Her reflection was smiling at her. It wasn't her smile. Megan stopped dead in her tracks, her hand still on the door frame of the kitchen. The reflection in the mirror had a wide, unsettling grin, sharp teeth that weren't in her real smile. It was a smile that didn't belong to her, twisted and malevolent, frozen in place. Megan watched as the reflection in the mirror slowly turned its head to face her. The eyes in the reflection were dark, void-like, staring directly at her. She could feel the coldness from the mirror spreading through her, and her heart began to race. Before she could move, the reflection mouthed something at her. She couldn't hear it, but the words were unmistakable. "Come closer." Megan backed away, her breath quick and shallow. She turned to run, but when she looked back at the mirror, the figure in the reflection was gone. Just her own image stared back at her, looking as it should, no smile, no dark presence. Shaken, Megan tried to convince herself it was just a trick of the light, a fatigue-induced hallucination. But the next day, the same thing happened. As she passed the mirror, she saw the figure again, standing in the hallway behind her, just out of sight, its smile wider, more knowing. This time, Megan didn't look away. She stared into the mirror, her pulse pounding in her ears, watching as the figure in the reflection slowly started to move. It began to walk toward her, its movements smooth and deliberate. It was no longer just a shadow or a trick of the light. It was real. The figure reached out its hand toward the glass, pressing its palm against it, its face just inches from hers. Megan could feel the coldness from the mirror seep into her skin, a chill that made her blood run cold. The reflection's hand began to press harder, as though it was trying to break through the glass. Megan stumbled backward, her hands shaking, unable to take her eyes off the mirror. She felt trapped, as though the reflection was pulling her in. The figure's grin widened, and its eyes seemed to burn with an unnatural hunger. Without thinking, Megan grabbed the mirror off the wall and ran out the door, heading straight to the only place she could think of her neighbor, Mr. Dawson, an elderly man who had lived next door for years. She knocked on his door, frantic. Mr. Dawson opened it and looked at her with concern. "Megan, what's wrong?" I can't explain. I need help," she said, nearly in tears. "Please, I need you to take this mirror." Mr. Dawson frowned, but led her inside. She rushed into his living room, setting the mirror down on the floor between them. "What's going on with this mirror?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with suspicion. Before Megan could respond, the mirror began to vibrate, a low hum that seemed to reverberate through the floor. The reflection inside the glass twisted and stretched, pulling away from the surface, as if it was trying to break free. "Megan, you need to get rid of this," Mr. Dawson said urgently, stepping back. "This mirror has been cursed for years. It's not just a reflection. It traps souls." Megan's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" "This house, this town, there's a history here," Mr. Dawson explained. "Years ago, a man died in a fire, and his spirit was trapped in a mirror. Over time, it began to move from mirror to mirror, always looking for someone to take its place. It feeds off the living, and once it chooses someone..." He trailed off, his voice grim. Before Megan could respond, the mirror began to crack. The dark figure in the reflection was now fully standing, its shadowy form looming behind her, inching closer to the glass. The figure raised its hand, pressing against the crack in the mirror. "Megan, run," Mr. Dawson shouted. "Get out of here. The spirit will take you." But it was too late. The figure in the reflection stepped through the glass, its hand reaching out toward Megan's throat. With one final scream, Megan felt the cold grasp of the reflection pull her in, and just like that, she was gone. The next morning, Mr. Dawson found the mirror empty. Megan was nowhere to be found, and in the reflection, there was only a smile. Story 5. The Shadow on the Stairs. When Lily and her younger brother, Ben, moved into their new home, they were excited. The house was large and beautiful, an old colonial-style house on the edge of town, with a sweeping staircase and a vast, overgrown garden. The price had been surprisingly low, but there was something about the house that felt alive, as if it had a history waiting to be uncovered. Their parents were busy unpacking, but Ben and Lily wasted no time exploring. The house had 3 floors, each filled with old furniture, dusty rooms, and narrow hallways. Everything felt just a little bit off, like it was caught between the past and the present. But what caught Lily's attention the most was the staircase, a grand wooden staircase with polished balusters spiraling up to the 2nd floor. It was beautiful, but it gave her an uneasy feeling whenever she walked up or down. At night, when the house settled, the staircase creaked, sending a chill down her spine. Lily often found herself waking up in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, hearing the soft, deliberate creaking of the stairs. She told herself it was just the house settling, but the noise seemed too purposeful, as if someone was walking up and down the stairs at the same time each night. One evening, after a particularly long day of unpacking, Lily was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when she heard it. Again the creaking of the stairs, only this time it wasn't just 1 or 2 creaks. The sound was slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing up and down the stairs. She glanced toward the staircase, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The house was quiet again. She told herself it was just her imagination. But that night, the noises continued. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she heard the footsteps, again slow, heavy, and unmistakable. They were coming from the stairs. Lily sat up in bed and listened intently. The sound came again, this time louder. She felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and tiptoed out into the hallway. The house was dark, and the stairs stood like a looming shadow in the dim light. There was no one there. She breathed a sigh of relief and was about to head back to her room when she saw something, a shadow. It was faint at first, just a dark shape at the top of the stairs. But as Lily watched, it moved. It was tall and thin, a figure that seemed to be standing still, but also shifting, as if it were a trick of the light. The shadow appeared to stretch down the stairs, curling toward her. Frozen in place, Lily couldn't move. The figure was now unmistakably a tall, thin silhouette of a person, standing motionless at the top of the staircase. Its features were hidden, but Lily could feel its presence, a cold, oppressive weight in the air. Suddenly, the shadow began to move down the stairs, step by step, with slow, deliberate movements. Lily's heart raced as it drew closer, its form becoming clearer, but still unrecognizable. It was as if the shadow had no face, just an endless dark mass that seemed to loom and stretch as it moved closer. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The shadow was almost at the bottom of the stairs now, and Lily could feel the icy chill in the air wrapping around her, constricting her chest. Then, just as it reached the bottom of the stairs, the shadow stopped. It stood there, motionless, looking right at her. No face, no eyes, just a presence that filled the hallway with an unbearable heaviness. Lily backed away slowly, never taking her eyes off the shadow. As she reached the hallway light switch, the shadow seemed to flicker for a moment, then vanish completely. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat in her room, staring at the door, heart pounding. She couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was still there, waiting, that it was always watching her, waiting for her to go back to the stairs. The next morning, Lily told Ben about what she had seen. Ben, being younger, was initially frightened, but when they checked the stairs, they found nothing. No sign of anything out of the ordinary, just the same old staircase. But Lily couldn't ignore the feeling, the cold presence that seemed to linger in the air. That night, when the house settled and the creaking of the stairs returned, Lily made a decision. She would get to the bottom of it. She had to know who or what was on the stairs. She crept back into the hallway that evening, flashlight in hand, determined to face whatever was there. But as she reached the bottom of the staircase, she felt a strange pull, a compulsion to look up. And there, at the top of the stairs, was the shadow again. This time, it didn't move. Instead, it stood there, frozen in place, like it was waiting for her to come closer. And then, just as Lily stepped forward, the shadow began to whisper. It wasn't words, just an unintelligible murmur, but the tone was clear, angry, desperate. The whisper grew louder, more frantic, until it sounded like a scream, echoing through the walls of the house. Lily ran, her heart hammering in her chest, and slammed the door behind her. She didn't stop running until she was outside, breathless, shaking with fear. The next morning, she and Ben told their parents they were leaving. They couldn't stay in that house any longer. But as they walked away, Lily glanced back at the staircase one last time. At the top of the stairs, the shadow stood, watching her leave. And as she turned away, she swore she heard a faint whisper, as if it were calling her name. And then the house was silent once more. Story 6. The Man in the Attic. Sarah had always been drawn to old houses. The charm, the history, they all fascinated her. So when she and her husband, Ethan, found the beautiful, century-old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, they were thrilled. The price was unbelievably low, and the house had everything they wanted: spacious rooms, a large kitchen, and even an attic that seemed perfect for storage. The first few weeks in the house were They unpacked their belongings, redecorated, and spent peaceful evenings by the fireplace. But there was one thing about the house that unsettled Sarah: the attic. It was a small, cramped space, tucked away behind a narrow staircase. Despite the house's charm, the attic always felt cold and oppressive. Sarah had never been able to shake the feeling that something was watching her when she went up there. The air was thick, and the wooden floorboards creaked under her feet, almost as if something heavy was moving above her. One evening, while Sarah was sorting through boxes in the attic, she discovered an old, dusty trunk hidden in the far corner. It was locked, but curiosity got the better of her. She found an old key in a drawer downstairs, and when she returned to the attic, she unlocked the trunk. Inside, there were only a few items: a weathered coat, a worn-out pair of shoes, and an old, faded photograph. Sarah picked up the photo, her heart skipping a beat. It was a picture of a man, his face partially obscured by shadows, standing in front of the very house she was now living in. The photograph was dated 1924. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she stared at the man. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he was looking at the camera, as though he was staring directly at her. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She shared the photograph with Ethan, but he didn't seem worried. He laughed it off, saying it was just an old memento from the previous owners, but Sarah couldn't let it go. There was something about the man in the photo that felt wrong. The next few nights, Sarah began hearing strange noises coming from the attic: scratching, shuffling, and the sound of something heavy moving across the floor. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, convinced that someone or something was up there. One evening, unable to ignore it any longer, Sarah decided to confront whatever was in the attic. She grabbed a flashlight and slowly made her way up the narrow staircase. The air was colder than usual, and the floorboards creaked with each step. When she reached the top, she froze. The attic was empty, just as it had always been, but something was different. In the corner where she had found the trunk, there was now a dark shape, a figure standing motionless in the shadows. It was the man from the photograph. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The man's eyes were wide open, but his face was pale and gaunt, as if he hadn't been alive for a long time. He was wearing the same worn-out coat from the trunk. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as though studying her. Then he took a slow, deliberate step forward. Fear surged through Sarah's body, and she turned to run. But before she could reach the stairs, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have opened the trunk." The voice was raspy, like dry leaves scraping against stone. Sarah spun around, but the man was gone. The attic was empty once more, except for the lingering sense of dread. She ran back downstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. That night, she locked the attic door and refused to go near it again. The next morning, Sarah went to the local library. Desperate to learn more about the house's history, she found a dusty old newspaper clipping from 1924, the same year the photograph was taken. It told the story of a man named Samuel Hargrave, who had lived in the house before it had been abandoned. According to the article, Samuel had disappeared without a trace, and no one knew what happened to him. The house had been left vacant for years, and the new owners had never spoken of Samuel again. Sarah's hands shook as she read the article. It was clear now Samuel Hargrave was the man in the photograph, But why was he still here? That night, Sarah heard the noises again, the scratching, the shuffle. But this time, they were louder, closer. She tried to ignore them, but the sound grew more frantic, as though something was desperately trying to escape. The next morning, Sarah and Ethan decided it was time to move. But when they went to the attic to retrieve their things, they found the trunk gone. The attic was empty, save for the faint scent of mildew and decay. As they left the house for the last time, Sarah glanced up at the attic window. There, just behind the glass, she saw him, Samuel Hargrave, standing in the shadows, watching her leave. His grin was wide and knowing, and then he disappeared. Sarah never returned to the house, but sometimes, late at night, she swears she can still hear the scratching from the attic, as if the man in the shadows is still waiting for someone to open the door. Story 7. The Smiling Man. It was late at night when Jack, a young professional, was walking home from his late shift at the office. The streets of the city were mostly empty, with only the occasional car passing by. The dim streetlights cast long, eerie shadows on the sidewalk, and Jack's footsteps echoed in the silence. As he walked down an empty block, he noticed a figure standing at the far end of the street. The man was tall, wearing a long coat, with his hands in his pockets, and he appeared to be waiting for something. Jack didn't think much of it at first, assuming the man was just another late-night traveler. He continued walking, but as he got closer, he realized something was strange. The man wasn't moving. Jack slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing as he observed the man more closely. His face was pale, too pale, and his lips stretched into a wide, unsettling grin. At first, Jack thought he was imagining it, but the longer he stared, the more the man's grin seemed to grow. It was unnatural, like a mask that could barely contain the grotesque smile underneath. The man's eyes were wide and gleaming, fixed on Jack with an intensity that made him feel uncomfortable. Suddenly, the man took a step forward. Jack froze in place, his heart racing. The smile never faded. "Are you lost?" the man asked, his voice low and oddly pleasant. Jack's instincts screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to smile politely. "No, I'm just on my way home." He turned to walk away, but the man took another step. "Don't go," the man said, his voice now a little louder. "I just want to talk." Jack's nerves were on edge, but he didn't want to seem rude. He turned back to face the man, keeping his distance. "I'm fine, really. I need to go." The man's grin widened even more, stretching unnaturally across his face. "It's such a lovely night to talk, don't you think?" Jack's pulse quickened. There was something off about the man, something that set every alarm in his head ringing. The way his smile never wavered, how it seemed to grow with every passing second, was enough to make Jack's stomach churn. Without warning, the man took a step closer again, his movements strangely smooth, almost like he was gliding toward Jack. His grin stretched impossibly wide now, and Jack could see the tips of sharp, jagged teeth behind his lips. "I think you should stay," the man said, his voice now a distorted whisper. "Stay with me, Jack. Stay forever." Jack's body seized up with terror. He didn't know how the man knew his name, but there was no time to think. His fight or flight instinct kicked in, and Jack bolted down the street, running as fast as he could. He didn't look back, but he could hear the man's footsteps following, growing louder and faster, as if the figure were gaining on him. Jack turned a corner and spotted a small convenience store still open in the distance. His legs burned, but he pushed himself harder, praying he could make it before the man caught him. He reached the door of the store and yanked it open, rushing inside and slamming it shut behind him. The clerk, a tired-looking woman, looked up in surprise. "What happened?" she asked, concerned. Jack could barely catch his breath, but he managed to stammer, "There's someone. He's following me." The woman's eyes widened, and she glanced toward the door. "Are you sure?" "I didn't see anyone." Jack turned to look out the window, his heart still pounding in his chest. But the street was empty now, eerily silent. The man was gone. He stood there for a moment, trying to calm his breath, but something didn't sit right. "What's going on?" Jack asked. "Who was that man?" The woman hesitated before speaking. "I've been here all night, and I haven't seen anyone," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "But you should know something about this street." Jack turned to face her, confused. "The people who see him don't come back," she said quietly. "Not the same, anyway. They either forget or they start seeing him everywhere, smiling at them from across the street, waiting in doorways." Jack swallowed hard, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His mind raced, and his thoughts swirled in panic. "Who is he?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman paused, her face pale. "He's called the Smiling Man, and once he sees you, you'll never be free." Jack didn't ask any more questions. He spent the rest of the night in the store, watching the door, but the man never appeared again. When he finally left, the streets were empty. The smile was gone, but Jack knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. He would see the smile again, and it would follow him, no matter where he went. Every time he looked over his shoulder, it would be there, waiting, and, like all those before him, Jack would never escape the man who smiled. Story 8. The Endless Corridor. In a remote village nestled between mountains and forests, there was an old, crumbling mansion known as Blackwood Manor. The locals avoided it at all costs, claiming it was cursed. Rumors of disappearances, ghostly sightings, and sinister whispers had plagued the manor for over a century. Eleanor was a historian with a fascination for the paranormal. When she heard about Blackwood Manor, she knew she had to investigate. She packed her camera, notebook, and some supplies, determined to spend the night documenting its secrets. She arrived in the late afternoon, the setting sun casting long shadows over the estate. The iron gates creaked as she pushed them open, and the overgrown garden seemed to watch her every move. The mansion loomed before her, its windows like dark, hollow eyes. Inside, the air was damp and cold. The grand foyer was coated in dust, the chandelier above swaying slightly despite the absence of wind. Eleanor's footsteps echoed as she began her exploration, taking photos and jotting down notes. In one of the bedrooms, she found an ornate mirror covered with a sheet. When she pulled it off, she caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection, but when she turned, there was nothing there. As night fell, the atmosphere grew heavier. Shadows seemed to shift on their own, and faint whispers echoed through the halls. Eleanor dismissed it as her imagination, chalking it up to the eerie setting. But then she found the corridor. It was on the second floor, tucked behind a hidden door in the library. The hallway stretched impossibly far, much longer than the mansion itself should allow. The walls were lined with old portraits, their painted eyes following her as she walked. She felt the chill as she ventured deeper. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, though she couldn't make out the words. Halfway down the corridor, she noticed something strange. The portraits were changing. At first, it was subtle eyes glancing in a different direction, mouths curling into faint smiles. But as she continued, the changes became more grotesque. Faces twisted into expressions of pain and fear, their eyes pleading with her to turn back. Eleanor tried to return to the library, but when she turned around, the corridor stretched endlessly in both directions. Panic set in as she quickened her pace, her footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then she saw the first door. It was a simple wooden door with no handle, just a faint symbol carved into its surface or spiral. As she approached, she felt a pull as if the door were beckoning her. Against her better judgment, she placed her hand on it. The door creaked open, revealing a dark room lit by a single flickering candle. In the center stood a figure, a woman in a tattered black dress, her back turned to Eleanor. The whispers grew deafening as the woman slowly turned, revealing a face that was eerily familiar. It was Eleanor. Her doppelganger smiled, her eyes black as coal. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice layered with 100 others. Eleanor stumbled back, slamming the door shut. She ran down the corridor, but it seemed to stretch on forever. More doors appeared on either side, each with strange symbols. Some emitted faint cries, others laughter, and one seemed to vibrate as if something monstrous was clawing to get out. She finally reached a door at the end of the corridor. Unlike the others, it was massive and made of iron, covered in rust and chains. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but knew she had no choice. When she pushed it open, she found herself back in the foyer of the mansion. Everything was as it had been when she first arrived, except for one detail. The portraits on the walls now featured her face, twisted in terror. Eleanor fled the mansion, vowing never to return. But no matter where she went, the whispers followed her. Every mirror she passed showed her doppelganger watching, smiling, waiting. Years later, Blackwood Manor still stands, and the locals say that if you find the endless corridor, you might just see Eleanor's portrait among the others, her painted eyes forever pleading for escape. The silent train. Late one foggy evening, Mark found himself stranded at a rural train station. His car had broken down miles away, and the only way back to the city was to catch the midnight train. The station was old and eerily quiet, its wooden benches worn smooth by time and its single flickering lamp casting long shadows across the platform. The station master, an elderly man with a stooped posture, had warned Mark about the train. "It doesn't come often," he said, his voice trembling, "and when it does, you should think twice about boarding." Mark dismissed the warning as the ramblings of an old man. He didn't have a choice. He needed to get home. As the clock struck midnight, the faint sound of a train whistle pierced the silence. A cold wind swept through the station, and Mark turned to see a sleek, black train gliding out of the fog. It made no sound as it came to a stop, not the screech of brakes, nor the hiss of steam. The doors slid open, revealing an empty interior lit by a faint, unnatural glow. Hesitant, Mark stepped aboard. The train began to move as soon as he sat down. There was no conductor, no other passengers, just rows of worn leather seats and the rhythmic clatter of wheels on the tracks. Looking out the window, Mark realized the landscape wasn't changing. It was as if the train was moving, but the world outside remained frozen in time. Then he noticed the reflection in the window. He could see the faint outline of other passengers, shadowy figures, sitting silently in the seats around him. When he turned to look directly, the seats were empty. The lights flickered, and the air grew colder. Mark's breath fogged in front of him as he heard a whisper, faint but distinct. "You shouldn't be here." Panic set in. He tried to move to another car, but the doors wouldn't budge. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Get off before it's too late." The train slowed, and Mark saw a platform outside. It wasn't the city station he was It was a decrepit stop surrounded by trees cloaked in mist. He hesitated, but the whispers turned into a chorus of voices, all shouting now, "Get off, get off." Mark leaped from the train just as it began to move again. He landed hard on the platform, scraping his palms and knees. When he looked up, the train had vanished, its whistle echoing faintly in the distance. He was alone. The platform was falling apart, overgrown with weeds. A rusted sign read, "Eden Station," though the name meant nothing to him. Behind him, the trees rustled. He turned to see shadowy figures watching him from the darkness, their empty eyes glowing faintly. Mark ran, but the forest seemed endless. The last thing he heard before the shadows overtook him was the distant whistle of the silent train, returning for its next passenger months later. The station master would tell the story of the young man who disappeared that night, and sometimes, late at night, he swore he could see Mark's reflection in the windows of the midnight train, staring back, silently screaming. Story 9. The House That Whispers. Deep in the countryside, hidden by a grove of ancient oaks, stood a house no one dared enter. It had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, its walls covered in ivy. Locals called it Hollow Manor, saying it was alive, that it whispered secrets to those foolish enough to get close. When Amelia inherited the house from a distant relative, she saw it as an opportunity to escape her city life. Ignoring the townsfolk's warnings, she packed her belongings and moved in. The house was eerie but beautiful in its way. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the air carried a faint, musty scent. The first night was uneventful, though Amelia found it hard to sleep. She kept hearing faint noises, soft murmurs that seemed to come from the walls. She chalked it up to her imagination and drifted off. On the second night, she heard it clearly, a whisper, "Amelia." She sat up in bed, her heart racing. The voice was faint, almost gentle, but unmistakable. She grabbed a flashlight and searched the house, but there was no one there. By the third night, the whispers had multiplied. They came from every corner of the house, overlapping and growing louder. "Amelia, leave. You're not safe." Terrified, she decided to leave the next morning. As she packed her bags, she found a journal tucked away in a drawer. It belonged to her Gretchen, the previous owner. The entries were erratic, filled with ramblings about the whispers and the house watching. One entry caught Amelia's attention. "They speak to warn you, but they cannot stop it. The house hungers. It always has." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. She slammed the journal shut and ran to her car, determined to drive away and never return. But the car wouldn't start. The battery was dead. When she returned to the house to call for help, the front door slammed shut behind her. The whispers were louder now, deafening, a cacophony of voices, all saying the same thing. "Run." The floorboards groaned. and the walls seemed to shift as if the house were breathing. Desperate, Amelia ran for the back door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into screams. From the corner of her eye, she saw something move, a shadow, tall and twisting, emerging from the wall. It reached for her with long, spindly arms. The last thing Amelia heard before everything went dark was the house itself, whispering, "You are mine." When the townsfolk finally dared to investigate weeks later, the house was empty. Amelia was gone. But on quiet nights, if you stand near Hollow Manor, you can hear her voice among the whispers, begging for freedom. Story 10. The Lighthouse Keeper. On a desolate stretch of coastline, where the waves crashed violently against jagged rocks, stood an old lighthouse. It was said to be cursed, abandoned years ago after the keeper mysteriously vanished. Locals avoided it, claiming to see its light flicker during storms, despite there being no one to tend it. When Daniel, a marine biologist, was assigned to study the tides in the area, he decided to stay at the lighthouse. He scoffed at the ghost stories, attributing them to wild imaginations. Armed with his research, equipment, and a week's worth of supplies, he moved in. The first night was uneventful. The wind howled outside, and the waves roared, but Daniel slept soundly. On the second night, however, he woke to the sound of footsteps echoing from the spiral staircase. "Hello," he called, his voice breaking the silence. No answer. He grabbed a flashlight and ventured out of his room. The narrow staircase spiraled up into darkness, but there was no one there. Convinced it was just the old building settling, he returned to bed. On the third night, the light at the top of the tower turned on. Daniel hadn't touched the controls, and the bulb hadn't been functional when he arrived. Confused, he climbed the staircase to investigate. The room was empty, but the light was spinning, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. As he examined the machinery, he noticed something. The bulb wasn't connected to any power source. A chill ran down his spine. He descended the stairs quickly, but as he reached the bottom, he froze. Wet footprints trailed across the floor, leading from the door to the staircase. Daniel locked the door and tried to calm himself. He told himself it was just his imagination. He saw a figure outside the window. It was a man, drenched from head to toe, staring at him with wide, empty eyes. Before Daniel could react, the figure disappeared. That night, he couldn't sleep. The footsteps returned, louder this time, pacing the stairs. And then, the whispers began. "Why did you take my place?" Daniel's blood ran cold. He grabbed his flashlight and his coat, determined to leave. But when he opened the door, the storm outside was so fierce he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Reluctantly, he stayed. The whispers grew louder as the night wore on, and the light from the tower flickered erratically. Daniel barricaded himself in his room, but the whispers seeped through the walls. By dawn, the storm had passed. Daniel stumbled outside, ready to leave and never return. But as he looked back at the lighthouse, he saw the figure again standing in the top room, staring down at him. When the locals found Daniel's abandoned car days later, the lighthouse was empty. His belongings were still inside, but there was no sign of him. Weeks later, the light began to shine again, spinning through the darkness during storms, as if the lighthouse had found its new keeper. Story 11. The Shadow in the Well. In the countryside of a small, forgotten town, there was an ancient well that stood in the middle of an overgrown field. Locals called it the Whispering Well, claiming it was cursed. They said if you leaned close enough to the edge, you could hear voices calling from the darkness below. Some believed it was the souls of those who had fallen in. Others thought it was something far worse. No one dared go near it. But when 16-year-old Sophie moved to the town with her family, she didn't know the legend. Her family had bought an old farmhouse near the field, and Sophie often wandered out there to explore. One golden evening, as the sun dipped low, Sophie spotted the well for the first time. The moss-covered stones were crumbling, and wooden planks were hastily nailed over the top, as if to keep something inside. Curious, she approached it. As she drew near, she thought she heard something, a faint, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. She brushed it off as the wind and leaned closer. "Help me," a voice whispered from the well. Sophie jumped back, heart pounding. She stared at the planks, expecting to see someone, but the field was empty. She told herself it was her imagination and hurried home. That night, she had a nightmare about the well. She dreamed of falling into its endless darkness, a cold hand grabbing her ankle and pulling her down. She woke up in a sweat, the sound of the voice still echoing in her ears. The next morning, Sophie decided to tell her parents about the well, but when she mentioned it, her mother's face turned pale. "Don't go near that well," her mother said firmly. "It's dangerous." When Sophie pressed her for details, her mother refused to explain. Frustrated and more curious than ever, Sophie decided to return to the well that evening. This time, she brought a flashlight. She pried off one of the planks and shone the light into the darkness below. The beam barely reached the bottom, but as she leaned closer, she thought she saw something move, something pale and human-like. Suddenly, the voice came again, louder this time. "Help me, please." It sounded like a child. Against her better judgment, Sophie called back, "Who's there? Are you hurt?" There was no response, only the sound of something scraping against the stone walls. Then, the voice came again, but now it was behind her. "Why did you look?" Sophie spun around, but no one was there. When she turned back to the well, her flashlight flickered and died. In the faint moonlight, she saw something climbing out of the well, its limbs unnaturally long, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. She screamed and ran, not daring to look back until she was inside her house with the doors locked. That night, the nightmares returned, but this time, the shadowy figure wasn't in the well. It was standing at the foot of her bed, its cold voice whispering, "You shouldn't have looked." Sophie's family left the farmhouse the next day, but she was never the same. She claimed she could still hear the whispers, no matter how far she went. And back in the field, the well waited patiently for the next curious soul. Goodbye everyone, take care of yourself, and don't forget to subscribe and like Scary Stories channel.